Hello everyone, I am Rod and I am the game design instructor for the Academy of Entertainment Arts over at Dixie Hollands High School. If you are one of my students, it's Mr. Flowers to you, and welcome to this video tutorial. Alright, it looks like we are about ready to get animating on our little Eggy Whites guy here. What I want to do in this video, before we start actually dropping in keyframes and setting up the animation, is to finish one last piece of setting up the stage. So everything looks like it's ready to go, right? Except for one last thing. If we hop back into Photoshop here, there's one element we're missing. It's this stage light. It is present throughout the entire sequence. It wouldn't be very fun to animate without the stage light, right? And if we get down to our last frame, there's this other thing missing. We have our camera missing. And we're definitely going to need this in order to pull off this arcing camera animation. So we need to have both of these pieces in place before we can start doing our animation. So let's drop down to Maya. And luckily both of these elements are pretty easy to get into the scene. If we come up to the rendering tab, we should have a bunch of stuff right here. If you do not have any of these pieces, all your different stage lights and whatever, you can also make these under the Create tab. And you have lights, so here are all the lights you can make, cameras, and so on. I'm going to drag in a spotlight. And I do this, it'll drop down here in the center of the scene. We actually have it listed right here, Spotlight 1. You can't really see it because it's really tiny. I'm going to hit W on the keyboard so I can see it. And then I'm going to hit the R key to scale it. I'm just going to go drag this thing and make this huge. This will not really change how this thing produces light, but it will make it easier for us to see this particular object. Go ahead and drag it up, and I'm going to pull it back into the front of our scene, right about there. If we look back down at our images here, you can see the stage light's about there. And it projects kind of across the stage toward the door here. So if I jump back to Maya, I want to start using my light, but I can't see my light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press 7 on the keyboard, which uses all lights in the scene. And there we go. So right now it says use all lights, and you can see that our light is there, but it's not pointing where we need it. There are a few ways we can do this. We can manually rotate our light by hitting the E key and rotating it. Or, what's really cool about this particular light is it has a handle that you can use to help aim your light in your scene. If you have your light selected and then press the T key, it'll create a new little handle. It's hard to see, but it actually made a handle on top of your handle. I'm going to kind of zoom in. And we have 2 light handles. If you grab the other one, where are you? You can kind of pull it down and over. And you'll notice that your light stays in place, but it changes the angle of your light. So your light basically aims at this new little handle. And you can be as precise as you like. I can snap this thing down to the origin, just like that, to get it to aim there. Or I can pull it up or down or wherever to kind of get it to render our scene. And we can take a quick snapshot of how this is going to look. If we come up top, we have right here all of our little rendering presets. We have a little clapboard. This little whiteboard that has nothing else on it. This will render a current frame, so I can go ahead and click that. And then give it a second. And you can see that this is what would be recorded if we were to set this up to be rendered. All we can see is where the light is pointing. Now that might be good for some folks, but it's not really good enough for me. And the reason for this is that nothing is ever truly solid dark. Shadows are never this dark in reality. So we have to do some things to kind of diffuse the light, make it look like it's scattering, and make the light more realistic. So what I have to do, I'm going to hit and close this, is I need to create a second light. Now while we are focusing on single point lighting, and this does fit for the idea of single point lighting, so we have one primary light, one key light projecting into our scene, this is not as accurate as lighting could be if it were being projected in reality, because light bounces and it scatters. So even if this was the only light in our scene creating light, the energy coming out of this light would hit the stage, it would bounce, and you would have diffusion scattering here. So you would still see part of this in this scene. So I'm going to come up and I'm going to hit ambient light. I'm going to create that. And when I drop that in, you can see that it lightens up everything. I'll go ahead and re-render my scene here. And you can see now that I have my primary light, my key light is there, and I have this soft diffuse of light everywhere else. However, this is way too bright, so I have to change my light settings. I'll go ahead and close that. With my ambient light selected, you can see right here, it's still selected. I'm going to hit the E key. I'm going to go ahead and kind of grow this out just so I can see it a little bit easier in my scene. This isn't going to change what the light can do, but it should make it a little bit easier for me to see it. And I'm going to go ahead and lift it up. That way it's not hiding in the middle of my stage underneath the floor, but I can, if I unclick, I can see it very easily in my scene, and I can get a hold of it if I need to. Alright, I'm going to rotate, I'm going to grab my ambient light, and I'm going to adjust my light settings. So over here on our channel box, scroll down, we have ambient light settings, we have our light color. I'm not going to get too specific on light color, but I am going to adjust the light intensity. And I also want to make sure that my ambient light is not casting shadows, because remember, we are trying to use a setup of single point lighting. So in theory, we only have one light here. We're just using this ambient light to simulate the diffusion that would happen for the actual light that's there. So this light will not cast any shadows. It's just kind of like a fill light. I'm going to come over to intensity. I'm going to drop this down to 0.25. And this is already looking much softer and a more realistic effect, because we would have this bright light here with a little bit of fall off. I'm going to hit my render button again. Nice. Now there's another problem happening. I don't know if you can tell, but if you look back here at the back walls, see this little piece? Let's take a look at what's happening. I'm going to rotate my view here, and you can see that this light is cutting through and just hitting these objects, which isn't realistic at all. This curtain should block the majority of the light that's coming from this spotlight. This wall should definitely block every bit of light that comes from that spotlight, minus whatever crease gets through this door. And this wall should not have any light hitting it whatsoever. I know that this is open here, and you could argue that, well, maybe it would bounce, but this is just a simulation. And in reality, if this was a closed box, it should not have any light whatsoever. So we have to fix this. And the way to do that is there are a few options. We can come over, select our little cone light here, or our spotlight, and we have an option for using shadows. By default, it says to use ray trace for shadows and have that on. Well, we don't have ray trace actually turned on in our renderer right now. So I'm actually going to turn this off. We could turn ray tracing on, but ray tracing is more expensive for the system to use and it would take longer to render. So I'm going to come down here to use depth for shadows, and I'm going to turn this on by pressing 1 on the keyboard. And you can see that. If you want to turn something off, you can press 0 and hit enter, and it'll turn it on and off. And now I'm going to do another test render. And right away you can see that now we no longer have that light bleeding through, which is what we would like to have. Alright, so there's that piece. But if you look really closely up here, you see this? This little piece of gray is our handle that we created to control our curtains animation. This can't show up in our scene because we're not supposed to see that. So I'm going to hit this, and then what I want to do is select this particular handle. And when I do that, because it is parented, it selects both my curtain and my curtain rod, but I only want the curtain rod to be selected. So to select just the curtain rod, I'm going to use my arrow keys, and I'm going to toggle, I'm going to hit the down key. And what that's going to do is select just the curtain rod. And it's going to ignore the parenting system, so I can only affect the rod itself. Over here where I have curtain rod controller, I'm going to go up to edit. I'm going to come down to attribute editor. And that's going to change our channel box so we can see all these different attributes that this particular object has. And I'm going to come down to render stats. And under render stats, I'm going to do some stuff here. I'm going to make sure that it cannot cast any shadows. I don't want it to receive shadows. And for the moment, I'm going to turn primary visibility off. And now I'm going to hit my render and see what happens. And you can see that it has now become invisible in our scene, and we don't have to worry about seeing it. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and select the other one. Press down on the keyboard so that I can only have the rod. And I'm going to come over here to my channel box, and you can see that the render stats is already open and the attribute editor is already set up because we had this one open a second ago. I'm going to come down to cast shadows, uncheck that. It will not receive shadows, and we do not want this thing to be visible in the scene. And that should do it. If we have any other issues with it, like if it is creating reflections or other visibility issues, we can actually toggle all these off to make sure it's not going to show up at all. But we shouldn't have any of these issues going on right now. So I'm going to do a test render one more time. And there we go. We can see that those objects are not going to be rendered as we bake this out. I'm going to hit the little tab there. And now what I'm going to do is get in position to set up my camera. So right now I'm inside my primary camera. If I go to my panels, perspective, I'm inside the perspective camera by default in my perspective view. But I don't want to use my perspective camera to animate this scene. The reason I don't want to use my primary perspective view is I need my perspective view to look around to see if there's any problems as I render. So I'm going to set up a camera that will do all the recording for me that I won't have to interrupt while I'm working in my scene. So up here I have, under my rendering, I have render, and then I have create camera, or I can go up to create, come down to cameras, and just add a new camera to the scene. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And right away we get a camera in our scene. Now our camera shows up really tiny, just like our light did. So I'm going to hit the R key so I can scale this up. I'm going to make my camera kind of big looking. Now this does not change the size of the actual camera, it just makes it bigger so that I can see it in the scene. But it's actually a tiny little guy still. And now what I want to do is jump over to my channel box. Right here I'm going to double click, 1, 2, camera 1, and I'm going to use this as my renderable camera. So I'm going to give it a name just so it's not camera 1. And I will say, let's see, what should I name this? I'll say my scene camera. My scene camera. And that's scene with SCENE. So to look through this, I can go up to Panels, Perspective, and grab my scene camera. And you'll notice that we are now inside our camera. We can look at this as though we were inside any other perspective view. And I'm going to just move into position by my standard movements inside of Maya. So when I start, this camera should be about here. And then our stage is going to open up. And then our camera will rotate. Just kind of situate myself the way that I like. And now I'm going to jump out of my camera by hitting Panel, come down to Perspective, and jump into my perspective camera. So now I can fly around my perspective camera and I can see that my renderable camera is out here. So this one that's going to capture the scene is over here, and you can see it. And even if I'm looking this way in my perspective view, this camera is going to be the one that's going to do the recording, so I don't have to worry about where it's at. But what I do want is I want this camera to be able to pivot and move around my little Eggy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the actual pivot point of this camera so that it is centered around here. Now it's important that you pay attention to that, because when I do this, I'm going to be changing the pivot point of this thing. So it's not going to behave nicely like it is, because right now the pivot point's here. Once I move this pivot point, this camera's not going to move from this location. It's going to move relative to where the pivot point's sitting, which is going to be over here. Why that matters is it's going to allow me to orbit this camera pretty nicely, but it will mess up the controls that I have on the camera currently. I'm going to hit Insert on the keyboard. That'll allow me to move the pivot point, and I'm going to snap this down here about where Eggy is. And the way that I snapped it is I held X on the keyboard and then I pulled on the up arrow, and that snapped it to the floor there. So now if I go back into my renderable camera, so go up to Panel, Perspective, my renderable camera, and I hit Insert on the keyboard to get rid of the moving. I will hit E, and now when I go to rotate, you can see that I can pan and rotate right around my egg. That little bit of a jumping is it's just kind of glitchy out, but that's not too bad. There we go. And right here, I can also control how I move by grabbing my rotate Y, and I can just turn it manually. Yeah, it's trying to fight me. Stop fighting me. That's my mouse kind of jumping some positions there. There we go. Alright, so under my rotate Y, I'm going to hit 0. And now we're in position to where we can pretty much set up our scene and get it ready to render. So I'm going to do one more test render. And here we go. This is what we will see when we bake this out. Okay. From here, let's go ahead and save this, and when we come back, we will be ready to start animating our scene. Okay?